Question 1. Consider a scenario where a prospective buyer in Honolulu, Hawaii, expresses strong interest in purchasing a property and verbally asks a licensed real estate salesperson to help them find a suitable home and negotiate an offer. The buyer states they are eager to start looking at listings immediately and will sign any necessary paperwork once they find a property they like. What is the best professional approach for the salesperson to take in this situation? Adhering to Hawaii's real estate licensing laws and ethical standards. Option A. Proceed with showing properties and offering guidance without any written agreement, assuming the buyer will sign one when they are ready. Option B. Draft a buyer representation agreement only after the buyer has identified a specific property they wish to make an offer on. Option C. Verbally agree to represent the buyer and begin the property search, intending to draft and have the buyer sign a buyer representation agreement at a later date. Option D. Immediately begin showing properties and providing advice, with the understanding that a buyer representation agreement will be drafted and signed before any offer is submitted. The correct answer is D. Immediately begin showing properties and providing advice, with the understanding that a buyer representation agreement will be drafted and signed before any offer is submitted. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in real estate brokerage, specifically concerning the fiduciary duties owed to a client and the importance of clear, written agreements. The challenge lies in navigating a client's informal request while adhering to the strict requirements of Hawaii's real estate licensing laws and ethical best practices. A licensed real estate salesperson in Hawaii has a legal and ethical obligation to represent their clients diligently and transparently. This includes ensuring that all agreements for representation are in writing and clearly define the scope of services, duration, and compensation. Failure to do so can lead to disputes, misunderstandings, and potential violations of Hawaii Revised Statute Chapter 467, which governs real estate licensing and practices. The best approach involves obtaining a fully executed written buyer representation agreement before commencing substantive services. This agreement serves as the foundational document outlining the terms of the brokerage relationship, protecting both the buyer and the agent. It ensures clarity on expectations, responsibilities, and compensation, thereby preventing future disputes and demonstrating adherence to professional standards and Hawaii's regulatory framework. This written agreement is crucial for establishing a legally binding relationship and fulfilling the agent's fiduciary duties. An approach that involves verbally agreeing to represent the buyer and then drafting the agreement later is professionally unacceptable. This practice creates a significant risk of misinterpretation of terms and expectations. Without a written agreement in place at the outset, the agent may be seen as acting without proper authority or clear contractual terms, potentially violating Hawaii's requirement for written agreements for brokerage services. Furthermore, it undermines the agent's ability to prove the agreed-upon terms if a dispute arises. Another unacceptable approach is to proceed with showing properties and providing advice without any written agreement, assuming the buyer will sign one eventually. This constitutes practicing without a clear contractual basis for the relationship and can be interpreted as a violation of the duty to act in the client's best interest with full transparency. It exposes both the agent and the brokerage to liability and ethical breaches, as the scope of representation and compensation are undefined. Finally, an approach that involves drafting a buyer representation agreement only after the buyer expresses interest in a specific property is also problematic. This timing suggests that the agreement is being drafted reactively, rather than proactively establishing the terms of representation from the beginning of the professional relationship. It can create an appearance of impropriety, as the agent might be perceived as prioritizing securing a commission over clearly defining the scope of their duties and the buyer's rights from the initial engagement. Professionals should adopt a proactive decision-making process that prioritizes establishing clear, written agreements at the very beginning of any client relationship. This involves educating clients on the necessity of these agreements, explaining their terms thoroughly, and ensuring all parties understand and sign the document before any significant brokerage activities commence. This practice not only ensures compliance with Hawaii's real estate laws, but also fosters trust and professionalism. Question 2. Upon reviewing a mortgage loan application for a property in Honolulu, Hawaii, a loan originator discovers that the borrower's stated income appears insufficient to qualify for the requested loan amount based on the lender's standard underwriting guidelines. The borrower expresses strong desire for the property and asks if the income figures can be slightly adjusted on the application to make it appear more favorable. What is the most appropriate course of action for the loan originator? Option A. Inform the borrower that the loan cannot proceed as requested and suggest they seek financing elsewhere without offering any further assistance or alternative solutions. Option B. Contact the underwriter directly and request they overlook the income discrepancy, emphasizing the borrower's strong desire to purchase the property. Option C. Advise the borrower that all income information must be accurate and verifiable, and explore legitimate options to strengthen the application or identify alternative loan programs that may be suitable, while ensuring full compliance with Hawaii's lending regulations. Option D. Submit the application with the borrower's requested income adjustment, assuming the underwriter will likely approve it given the borrower's enthusiasm for the property. Correct answer is C. Advise the borrower that all income information must be accurate and verifiable, and explore legitimate options to strengthen the application or identify alternative loan programs that may be suitable, while ensuring full compliance with Hawaii's lending regulations. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a loan originator to balance the need to secure a loan for a client with the absolute requirement to adhere to underwriting standards and regulatory compliance. Misrepresenting information or circumventing established processes can lead to severe consequences for the borrower, the originator, and the lending institution, including regulatory penalties and damage to professional reputation. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions are ethical and legally sound. The correct approach involves diligently verifying all provided information and ensuring the loan application accurately reflects the borrower's financial situation and the property's value, even if it means the loan may not be approved under current guidelines. This aligns with the principles of responsible lending and the requirements of Hawaii's mortgage lending regulations, which mandate truthful representation of all material facts in loan applications. By adhering to established underwriting guidelines and seeking clarification or alternative solutions within legal parameters, the loan originator upholds their fiduciary duty to the client and the integrity of the lending process. This approach prioritizes accuracy and compliance, ensuring that any loan approved is sound and meets all regulatory requirements. An incorrect approach involves submitting an application with deliberately misleading information about the borrower's income or the property's condition to force an approval. This violates Hawaii's laws against mortgage fraud and misrepresentation, which carry significant penalties. It undermines the underwriting process, which is designed to protect both the borrower from unaffordable debt and the lender from excessive risk. Another incorrect approach is to pressure the underwriter to approve a loan that does not meet the established criteria without providing sufficient justification or alternative mitigating factors. This bypasses the established risk assessment protocols and can lead to the approval of loans that are likely to default, violating prudent lending practices and potentially breaching regulatory expectations for sound loan origination. A further incorrect approach is to advise the borrower to provide inaccurate information, such as inflating their stated income or down payment. This constitutes aiding and abetting fraudulent activity, directly contravening ethical obligations and specific prohibitions against deceptive practices in mortgage lending under Hawaii law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation and the property's value. They must then meticulously compare this information against the lender's underwriting guidelines and all applicable Hawaii state and federal regulations. If discrepancies or potential issues arise, the professional course of action is to communicate transparently with the borrower, explain the challenges, and explore legitimate options for strengthening the application or finding alternative loan products that fit within the established parameters. Escalating concerns to a supervisor or underwriter for guidance on how to proceed ethically and compliantly is also a critical step when faced with difficult situations. Question 3. When evaluating financing options for a client looking to sell their property quickly in Hawaii, and the client expresses interest in both hard money loans and seller financing, what is the most prudent course of action for a licensed real estate salesperson? Option A. Suggest seller financing as the easiest solution, focusing on the potential for a quick sale without detailing the legal requirements for promissory notes, deeds of trust, or the risks of buyer default. Option B. Advise the client that traditional bank financing is the safest and most common option, and discourage them from pursuing hard money or seller financing due to their perceived complexity and higher risk. Option C. Strongly recommend hard money loans as the fastest way to close, emphasizing the speed of the transaction while downplaying the associated higher interest rates and shorter repayment periods. Option D. Provide a detailed comparison of hard money loans and seller financing against traditional mortgage options, thoroughly explaining the terms, risks, potential costs, and legal implications of each, ensuring the client fully understands their choices before proceeding. The correct answer is D. Provide a detailed comparison of hard money loans and seller financing against traditional mortgage options, thoroughly explaining the terms, risks, potential costs, and legal implications of each, ensuring the client fully understands their choices before proceeding. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for real estate professionals in Hawaii, balancing the client's desire for a quick sale with the fiduciary duty to ensure the client understands the risks and benefits of various financing options, particularly those that may carry higher costs or less consumer protection than traditional mortgages. Hard money loans and seller financing, while potentially faster, often come with significant drawbacks that a licensee must proactively disclose and explain to avoid misrepresentation or facilitating a transaction detrimental to the client. The challenge lies in providing objective advice without steering the client away from a viable option solely based on personal preference, while still upholding the highest ethical standards and regulatory compliance under Hawaii law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly educating the client about the specific terms, risks, and potential consequences of both hard money loans and seller financing, as well as comparing them to traditional mortgage options available in Hawaii. This includes detailing interest rates, fees, repayment schedules, the potential for foreclosure, and the impact on the client's overall financial position. A licensee must ensure the client fully comprehends these details and can make an informed decision. This approach aligns with Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 467, which mandates licensees to act with honesty, integrity, and competence, and to disclose all material facts. It also reflects the ethical obligation to protect the client's interests by ensuring they are not entering into a transaction they do not fully understand or that could lead to financial hardship. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending only traditional bank financing without a comprehensive discussion of the client's stated interest in hard money or seller financing fails to address the client's specific needs and preferences, potentially leading to a missed opportunity for the client or a perception of inadequate service. This approach neglects the duty to explore all relevant options that might be suitable, even if they are less conventional. Pushing the client towards hard money loans solely because they offer a faster closing, without adequately explaining the significantly higher costs, shorter terms, and increased risk of default and foreclosure, constitutes a failure to disclose material facts and act in the client's best interest. This could be seen as prioritizing the transaction speed over the client's long-term financial well-being, violating ethical duties and potentially Hawaii's consumer protection laws related to lending practices. Suggesting that seller financing is always a superior option due to its perceived simplicity, without detailing the potential legal complexities, the need for proper documentation, and the risks associated with the seller becoming a lender, e.g., default by the buyer, is also a failure to provide complete and accurate information. This approach oversimplifies a complex financial arrangement and omits crucial disclosures required for informed consent. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach financing discussions by first understanding the client's goals, timeline, and financial situation. Then, they should present a balanced overview of all viable financing options, including their respective advantages and disadvantages, with a particular emphasis on the specific terms and risks associated with non-traditional options like hard money and seller financing. This involves acting as an educator and advisor, ensuring the client has all the necessary information to make a sound decision, and documenting these discussions. The licensee's role is to facilitate an informed transaction, not to dictate the financing method, always prioritizing the client's best interests and adhering strictly to Hawaii's real estate licensing laws and ethical guidelines. Question 4. The analysis reveals that a Hawaii real estate licensee is advising a seller on how to price a single-family home in a well-established neighborhood with a high volume of recent comparable sales, Considering the property type and market conditions, which valuation method would best support the licensee's fiduciary duty to provide accurate market guidance? Option A, income approach. Option B, cost approach. Option C, a combination of the income and cost approaches. Option D, comparative market analysis. The correct answer is D, comparative market analysis. Explanation. The analysis reveals a common scenario in Hawaii real estate where a licensee must advise a seller on the most appropriate method to determine a listing price. This situation is professionally challenging because the chosen valuation method directly impacts the seller's expectations, the property's marketability, and potentially the licensee's fiduciary duty. A licensee must exercise careful judgment to select an approach that is both legally compliant and ethically sound, ensuring the seller receives accurate and unbiased guidance. The most appropriate approach in this scenario is the comparative market analysis. This method is best suited for residential properties in active markets like those typically found in Hawaii, where there are numerous recent sales of similar homes. It involves analyzing recent sales of comparable properties, considering differences in features, location, and condition, to arrive at an estimated market value. Hawaii Administrative Rules, Chapter 16-99, specifically regarding real estate appraisals and valuations, implicitly supports the use of market-based approaches for typical residential listings by emphasizing the importance of providing accurate market information to clients. Ethically, a comparative market analysis aligns with the licensee's duty to represent the client's best interests by providing a realistic and defensible price range based on current market conditions. Using the income approach would be inappropriate and potentially misleading for a typical single-family residence in Hawaii, especially if the seller is not primarily concerned with rental income. This approach is designed for income-producing properties and relies on analyzing potential rental income and expenses, which are not the primary drivers of value for most owner-occupied homes. Failing to use a market-appropriate method could lead to an inaccurate valuation and misrepresentation of market value, violating the licensee's duty of care. Similarly, employing the cost approach as the primary method for a typical residential listing in Hawaii would be professionally unsound. This approach estimates value by calculating the cost to replace the property minus depreciation plus land value. While it can be useful for unique properties or new construction, it often overestimates value for older homes where depreciation is difficult to accurately assess and market factors are more influential. Relying solely on this method without considering current market sales would not provide the seller with a realistic understanding of what a buyer is willing to pay in the current Hawaii market, potentially leading to overpricing and prolonged market exposure, which is not in the seller's best interest. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the property type, the local market conditions, and the seller's objectives. A licensee should first consider the most relevant and widely accepted valuation methods for the specific property type. For residential properties in active markets, a comparative market analysis is generally the most reliable. If the property has unique characteristics or is an income-producing asset, then other approaches might be considered as supplementary or primary, but always with a clear explanation to the seller about the method's applicability and limitations. The licensee's ultimate responsibility is to provide an informed opinion of value that is grounded in market reality and compliant with Hawaii's real estate regulations and ethical standards. Question 5. System analysis indicates that a real estate licensee in Hawaii is representing a landlord whose tenant's one-year fixed-term lease agreement expired on March 31st. The tenant has remained in the property and continued to pay rent, albeit a few days late each month, which the landlord has accepted. The landlord now wishes to terminate the tenancy and sell the property. Based on Hawaii revised statutes, what is the most appropriate advice the licensee should provide to the landlord regarding the current lease status and termination process? Option A. Advise the landlord to refuse all future rent payments to compel the tenant to vacate the premises. Option B. Advise the landlord that the property is now under a month-to-month lease and that termination requires providing the tenant with proper written notice as stipulated by Hawaii law for month-to-month tenancies. Option C. Advise the landlord to issue a 30-day notice to vacate immediately, citing the original lease expiration date as the basis for termination. Option D. Advise the landlord that the tenant is now a holdover tenant with no legal rights and can be evicted without formal notice. Correct answer is B. Advise the landlord that the property is now under a month-to-month lease, and that termination requires providing the tenant with proper written notice as stipulated by Hawaii law for month-to-month tenancies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate the nuances of lease agreements, specifically distinguishing between a fixed-term lease and a month-to-month tenancy, and understanding the implications of tenant actions on the lease status. Misinterpreting the lease type or the tenant's rights can lead to legal disputes, financial penalties for the landlord, and damage to the licensee's reputation and license. Careful judgment is required to apply Hawaii Revised Statutes, HRS, concerning landlord-tenant relationships and lease agreements. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves accurately identifying the lease agreement as a fixed-term lease that has expired, but has not been formally renewed or terminated according to its terms. Under HRS Section 521-71, a fixed-term tenancy automatically converts to a month-to-month tenancy upon expiration if the landlord accepts rent from the tenant. The tenant's continued occupancy and payment of rent, even if late, after the lease expiration date, without a new written agreement, signifies the landlord's acceptance of the month-to-month arrangement. Therefore, the licensee should advise the landlord that the property is now under a month-to-month lease, and that termination requires proper notice as stipulated by HRS Section 521-71B. This approach correctly applies the statutory provisions governing lease conversions and termination notice periods in Hawaii. Incorrect approaches analysis. Advising the landlord to immediately issue a 30-day notice to vacate based on the original lease expiration date is incorrect because it ignores the statutory conversion to a month-to-month tenancy. This would violate HRS Section 521-71 by not providing the tenant with the legally required notice for a month-to-month tenancy. Suggesting that the tenant is now a holdover tenant with no rights and can be evicted without notice is also incorrect and a direct violation of HRS Section 521-71, which protects tenants in month-to-month tenancies. Recommending that the landlord simply refuse to accept future rent payments to force the tenant out is an improper self-help eviction tactic, which is illegal in Hawaii and can lead to severe penalties for the landlord and the licensee. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize understanding the governing statutes of the specific jurisdiction. In Hawaii, HRS Chapter 521 outlines landlord and tenant rights and responsibilities. When faced with an expired lease, the licensee must determine if the tenancy has converted to a month-to-month arrangement by examining the actions of both parties, particularly the acceptance of rent. The licensee should then advise the landlord on the correct legal procedures for lease termination, which in this case involves providing the statutory notice for a month-to-month tenancy. Consulting legal counsel for complex situations is also a prudent step. Question 6. Implementation of a real estate transaction in Hawaii requires a licensee to explain different property ownership structures to a prospective buyer. The buyer is considering two properties, one offered as fee simple and another as leasehold. What is the most accurate and professionally responsible way for the Hawaii licensed real estate salesperson to explain these ownership types to the buyer? Option A. Inform the buyer that the primary difference is the monthly payment, and that both fee simple and leasehold properties offer similar long-term benefits and security. Option B. Advise the buyer that leasehold ownership is always a less desirable investment than fee simple ownership and should be avoided if possible. Option C. Explain that fee simple ownership means the buyer owns the land and improvements outright with no time limit, while leasehold ownership means the buyer has the right to use the land and improvements for a specific period as defined by a ground lease, and that fee simple generally represents a more complete and permanent form of ownership. Option D. State that leasehold ownership is essentially the same as renting an apartment, just on a larger scale, and that the buyer will not truly own the property. The correct answer is C. Explain that fee simple ownership means the buyer owns the land and improvements outright with no time limit, while leasehold ownership means the buyer has the right to use the land and improvements for a specific period as defined by a ground lease, and that fee simple generally represents a more complete and permanent form of ownership. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate licensee in Hawaii to accurately advise clients on the implications of different property ownership types, specifically distinguishing between fee simple and leasehold estates. Misunderstanding or misrepresenting these distinctions can lead to significant financial and legal consequences for the buyer, potentially resulting in litigation against the licensee and disciplinary action from the Hawaii Real Estate Commission. The licensee must demonstrate a thorough understanding of Hawaii property law and ethical obligations to provide competent and accurate advice. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves clearly and accurately explaining the fundamental differences between fee simple and leasehold ownership as they apply in Hawaii. This includes detailing that fee simple represents outright ownership of the land and any improvements, with no time limit, whereas leasehold involves owning the right to use the land and improvements for a specified period, subject to the terms of a ground lease with the landowner. The licensee should emphasize that fee simple is generally considered a more complete form of ownership, and often preferred by buyers due to its permanence and fewer encumbrances compared to the finite term and lease obligations of leasehold. This approach aligns with the Hawaii Real Estate Commission's mandate for licensees to act with honesty, integrity, and competence, ensuring clients receive accurate information to make informed decisions. Incorrect approaches analysis. Advising that leasehold ownership is always inferior to fee simple without qualification is an oversimplification and potentially misleading. While fee simple offers greater permanence, leasehold properties can be valuable investments, particularly in Hawaii where ground leases are common. Failing to explain the specific terms of the lease, such as the remaining lease term, rent escalation clauses, and any renewal options, constitutes a failure to provide complete and accurate information. Another incorrect approach is to suggest that leasehold ownership is essentially the same as renting, as this ignores the significant equity a leasehold owner can build and the rights they possess during the lease term. Furthermore, advising a client to avoid all leasehold properties without understanding their specific financial goals, risk tolerance, and the unique characteristics of the leasehold in question is unprofessional and goes beyond providing objective advice. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core legal distinctions between the ownership types relevant to the jurisdiction, Hawaii. They must then consider how these distinctions impact a client's rights, responsibilities, and financial interests. The decision-making process should prioritize clear, factual communication, avoiding personal opinions or generalizations. When advising on property ownership, licensees must educate clients about the nature of the estate, its duration, associated costs, and any potential limitations or obligations, empowering the client to make a decision aligned with their individual circumstances and objectives. Question 7. To address the challenge of accurately representing a property's nature to potential buyers in Hawaii, a real estate licensee is presented with a parcel of land that is zoned for agricultural use, currently features extensive fruit orchards, and has a small dwelling. The seller has expressed interest in marketing it as a potential site for a small business park due to its proximity to a main road. What is the most appropriate initial step for the licensee to take in classifying this property for marketing purposes? Option A. Determine the property's predominant use and physical characteristics to establish its primary classification, while acknowledging other potential uses in marketing materials with appropriate disclosures. Option B. Market the property primarily as a potential commercial development site, emphasizing its proximity to the main road and the seller's business aspirations. Option C. Accept the seller's assessment that the property is best suited for commercial development and market it accordingly without further investigation into its current use. Option D. Classify the property solely based on its agricultural zoning designation, as this is the most restrictive and legally binding classification. Correct answer is A. Determine the property's predominant use and physical characteristics to establish its primary classification, while acknowledging other potential uses in marketing materials with appropriate disclosures. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a real estate licensee must accurately identify the primary classification of a property to ensure compliance with Hawaii's real estate laws and ethical obligations. Misclassifying a property can lead to misrepresentation, improper marketing, and potentially violate licensing regulations. impacting both the client and the licensee. The licensee must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between the core purpose and characteristics of the property. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough assessment of the property's predominant use and characteristics to determine its primary classification under Hawaii real estate law. This approach is correct because Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 467, which governs real estate licensing, and related administrative rules, require licensees to act with honesty and integrity. Accurately classifying a property ensures that marketing efforts are truthful and that potential buyers are not misled about the property's suitability for their intended use. For instance, if a property is primarily used for growing crops and raising livestock, its agricultural nature dictates specific disclosures and marketing strategies that differ significantly from a residential or commercial property. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to classify the property based solely on its zoning designation, without considering its actual current use or physical characteristics. Zoning can be a factor, but it does not always reflect the primary function or the most advantageous marketing angle for the property. This can lead to misrepresentation if the zoning allows for multiple uses, but the property is predominantly used for one specific purpose. Another incorrect approach is to market the property based on a secondary or potential use that is not its primary characteristic, without clearly disclosing the primary classification. For example, advertising a property primarily as a potential commercial development site when its current and predominant use is agricultural, without emphasizing its agricultural aspects, could mislead buyers seeking agricultural land. This fails to provide a complete and accurate picture of the property. A further incorrect approach is to rely on the seller's subjective opinion of the property's type without independent verification or professional assessment. While seller input is valuable, the licensee has a fiduciary duty to verify information and provide expert guidance. Basing the classification solely on the seller's assertion, without considering objective factors, can perpetuate inaccuracies and lead to misrepresentation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach property classification by first understanding the definitions and distinctions between residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural properties as they apply under Hawaii law. This involves examining the property's physical attributes, current use, and any relevant zoning or land use regulations. The licensee should then consider the property's predominant purpose and how it is best marketed to attract the most appropriate buyers, always prioritizing truthfulness and transparency in all representations. Question 8. Examination of the data shows a potential client in Honolulu, Hawaii, is interested in facilitating the transfer of rights associated with a long-term leasehold agreement for a parcel of land, which includes the right to develop and sublease the property. What is the most critical initial step for a licensed Hawaii real estate salesperson to take to ensure compliance with state regulations? Option A. Focus solely on the development aspect of the leasehold agreement, as this is the primary interest of the client. Option B. Immediately begin marketing the leasehold rights to potential buyers, assuming it falls within standard real estate practices. Option C. Verify that the transaction involves the sale, purchase, lease, or exchange of land, tenements, or hereditaments, including all rights and interests therein, as defined by Hawaii Revised Statutes. Chapter 467. Option D. Advise the client that leasehold agreements are typically outside the scope of real estate licensing laws, and proceed without further investigation. The correct answer is C. Verify that the transaction involves the sale, purchase, lease, or exchange of land, tenements, or hereditaments, including all rights and interests therein, as defined by Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 467. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a salesperson to navigate the fundamental definition of real estate in Hawaii, while simultaneously assessing the potential risks associated with a transaction that might fall outside this definition. Misunderstanding the scope of real estate can lead to significant legal and ethical breaches, including misrepresentation, acting without a license, and potential financial harm to clients. Careful judgment is required to ensure all aspects of a property transaction align with Hawaii's real estate laws. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of the definition of real estate as stipulated by Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 467. This definition encompasses land, tenements, and hereditaments, including all rights and interests therein, whether corporeal or incorporeal. A salesperson must recognize that any transaction involving the sale, purchase, lease, or exchange of such interests falls under the purview of real estate licensing laws. Therefore, when presented with a situation that appears to involve real property rights, the salesperson's primary responsibility is to confirm it aligns with this statutory definition before proceeding, ensuring compliance with licensing requirements and ethical obligations to represent clients accurately within the legal framework of Hawaii. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that any transaction involving land automatically constitutes a real estate transaction requiring a license, without first verifying if it specifically involves the sale or transfer of rights or interests in that land as defined by statute. This can lead to unnecessary complications and potentially overstepping professional boundaries if the transaction is, for instance, a simple lease of personal property situated on land. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with a transaction that appears to involve rights or interests in land without consulting the Hawaii revised statutes or seeking guidance from a supervising broker or legal counsel. This demonstrates a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the regulatory framework governing real estate activities in Hawaii, potentially leading to unlicensed activity or misrepresentation. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss a transaction as not being real estate simply because it doesn't involve a traditional sale of a physical structure, without considering whether it involves the transfer of rights or interests in land, such as easements or mineral rights. This oversight can result in failing to identify a transaction that legally requires a licensed real estate professional. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves first identifying the core elements of the transaction. Then, they must cross-reference these elements against the statutory definition of real estate in Hawaii. If there is any ambiguity, or if the transaction appears to involve rights or interests in land, the professional should err on the side of caution, consult the relevant statutes, Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 467, and seek advice from their broker or legal counsel to ensure full compliance and ethical conduct. The priority is always to operate within the bounds of the law and to protect the interests of all parties involved. Question 9. Research into the current economic climate and projected growth in Hawaii's tourism sector has led a potential buyer to inquire about the likelihood of significant property value appreciation in the coming years. As a licensed real estate salesperson in Hawaii, what is the most appropriate approach to advising this client? Option A. Recommend that the client rely on their intuition and personal optimism regarding the Hawaii market, as this is often a reliable indicator of future investment success. Option B. Provide the client with a comprehensive overview of current Hawaii real estate market conditions, including relevant economic indicators, historical appreciation trends, and potential influencing factors, while emphasizing that future market performance cannot be guaranteed. Option C. Suggest that the client secure a mortgage that is significantly larger than their initial comfort level, explaining that this strategy will maximize their potential gains if property values indeed increase as expected. Option D. Advise the client that property values in Hawaii are virtually certain to rise substantially due to the strong correlation with anticipated increases in tourism, encouraging them to invest immediately. The correct answer is B. Provide the client with a comprehensive overview of current Hawaii real estate market conditions, including relevant economic indicators, historical appreciation trends, and potential influencing factors, while emphasizing that future market performance cannot be guaranteed. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Hawaii real estate licensee because it requires them to navigate the complexities of market fluctuations and their potential impact on a client's investment decision without engaging in speculative or misleading practices. The licensee must balance providing informed advice with adhering to strict ethical and regulatory standards that prohibit guaranteeing future market performance or providing financial advice beyond their licensing scope. Careful judgment is required to ensure the client's best interests are protected while maintaining professional integrity. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves educating the client about current market conditions in Hawaii, including historical trends, inventory levels, interest rate impacts, and local economic indicators that influence property values. This approach focuses on providing objective data and analysis, empowering the client to make an informed decision based on realistic expectations. This aligns with Hawaii's real estate licensing laws and ethical guidelines, which mandate honesty, fair dealing, and the avoidance of misrepresentation. Licensees are expected to act as fiduciaries, presenting factual information and advising on the potential risks and rewards associated with real estate investments, without making predictions or guarantees. Incorrect approaches analysis. Advising the client that property values in Hawaii are guaranteed to increase significantly due to anticipated tourism growth, without presenting supporting data or acknowledging potential risks, constitutes a misrepresentation and a failure to disclose material facts. This approach violates Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 467, which requires licensees to act with honesty and avoid making false promises. Suggesting that the client should invest solely based on a gut feeling about the market ignores the licensee's professional obligation to provide informed guidance and relies on subjective speculation rather than objective analysis, which is ethically unsound. Recommending that the client take out a larger loan than they are comfortable with to maximize potential returns, based on an unsubstantiated prediction of future appreciation, constitutes providing financial advice beyond the scope of a real estate license and could lead to financial harm for the client, violating fiduciary duties and potentially Chapter 467. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client education and informed consent. This involves gathering relevant market data, analyzing economic factors impacting the specific Hawaii market, and presenting this information clearly and objectively to the client. The licensee should then discuss potential scenarios, including both positive and negative outcomes, and encourage the client to consider their own financial situation and risk tolerance. Any advice given must be grounded in factual information and within the bounds of the licensee's expertise and licensing authority, always adhering to the principles of honesty, integrity, and fair dealing, as mandated by Hawaii real estate regulations. Question 10. Which approach would be most prudent for a Hawaii real estate salesperson managing a rental property when faced with an unexpected $5,000 repair bill for a malfunctioning HVAC system, considering the need to accurately assess financial impact and fulfill fiduciary duties? Option A. Estimate the repair cost at $4,000 based on general knowledge of such repairs, and proceed with authorizing the work without obtaining formal quotes. Option B. Advise the property owner to wait until the HVAC system completely fails before authorizing any repairs to avoid unnecessary upfront expenses. Option C. Obtain at least 3 detailed quotes from licensed HVAC contractors, factor in a 15% contingency for unforeseen complications, and calculate the projected impact on the property's annual net operating income. Option D. Immediately approve the first quote received for $5,000 without seeking additional estimates, assuming it is a standard repair cost. The correct answer is C. Obtain at least 3 detailed quotes from licensed HVAC contractors, factor in a 15% contingency for unforeseen complications, and calculate the projected impact on the property's annual net operating income. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in property management where unexpected repair costs arise, impacting the financial projections and potentially the profitability of an investment property. A licensed real estate salesperson in Hawaii must balance the fiduciary duty to their client, the property owner, with the need for prudent financial management and adherence to Hawaii's landlord-tenant laws and real estate regulations. The challenge lies in accurately estimating costs, securing necessary approvals, and ensuring transparency with the client, all while maintaining the property's value and tenant satisfaction. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a thorough risk assessment that quantifies potential repair costs and their impact on the property's financial performance. This includes obtaining multiple quotes from qualified contractors, factoring in a contingency fund for unforeseen issues, and projecting the return on investment for the repairs. This aligns with Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 521, Residential Landlord-Tenant Code, which emphasizes the landlord's responsibility for maintaining the premises in a habitable condition, and the general principles of real estate practice requiring licensees to exercise reasonable care and diligence. By proactively assessing and quantifying risks, the salesperson demonstrates due diligence and provides the client with data-driven recommendations for decision-making, fulfilling their fiduciary duty. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply approve the highest quote without further investigation. This fails to demonstrate due diligence and could lead to unnecessary expenses for the client, potentially violating the duty of care. It also ignores the principle of acting in the client's best financial interest. Another incorrect approach is to delay the decision until the repair is absolutely critical, potentially leading to further damage and higher costs, as well as tenant dissatisfaction. This reactive approach neglects the proactive risk management expected of a licensed professional and could violate the landlord's obligation to maintain the property. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to estimate the cost based on a rough guess, without obtaining professional quotes or considering a contingency. This lack of a data-driven assessment is unprofessional and exposes the client to significant financial uncertainty, failing to meet the standard of care required by Hawaii's real estate licensing laws. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always begin by understanding the client's objectives and the property's current condition. For maintenance and repair scenarios, a structured risk assessment process is crucial. This involves 1. Identifying potential repair needs, 2. Obtaining multiple detailed quotes from reputable service providers, 3. Estimating the total cost including a contingency percentage, e.g., 10-20% for unexpected issues, 4. Projecting the impact of these costs on the property's net operating income and overall return on investment, and 5. Presenting these findings clearly to the client with a well-reasoned recommendation. This systematic approach ensures informed decision-making, protects the client's interests, and upholds professional standards. Question 11. Operational review demonstrates that the Hawaii real estate market is experiencing a significant slowdown, with declining property values and increased inventory. A salesperson is working with both buyers and sellers. What is the most ethically sound and legally compliant approach for the salesperson to manage client expectations and guide their decisions during this period of market contraction? Option A. Focus on securing transactions to earn commissions, even if it means downplaying the severity of the market downturn and pushing clients towards deals that may not be in their best long-term financial interest. Option B. Assure clients that the market downturn is temporary and prices will rebound quickly, encouraging them to proceed with transactions based on optimistic but potentially unrealistic future market projections. Option C. Proactively educate clients about the current real estate cycle, provide realistic market data, discuss potential price adjustments, and explore alternative strategies tailored to their individual goals and the prevailing market conditions. Option D. Advise all clients to postpone any real estate transactions indefinitely until market conditions significantly improve, regardless of their personal circumstances or urgency. The correct answer is C. Proactively educate clients about the current real estate cycle, provide realistic market data, discuss potential price adjustments, and explore alternative strategies tailored to their individual goals and the prevailing market conditions. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Hawaii to navigate a market experiencing a downturn without resorting to misleading practices or violating Hawaii's stringent real estate regulations. The salesperson must balance their fiduciary duty to their clients with the economic realities of the market, ensuring transparency and ethical conduct. The best approach involves proactively educating clients about the current real estate cycle and its implications for their specific goals, such as selling or buying property in Hawaii. This includes providing realistic market data, discussing potential price adjustments, and exploring alternative strategies that align with the client's best interests and the prevailing market conditions. This approach is correct because it upholds the salesperson's duty of care and loyalty, fostering informed decision-making by the client. It aligns with Hawaii's real estate licensing laws, which mandate honesty, integrity, and fair dealing, and the Hawaii Association of Realtors Registered Code of Ethics, emphasizing the importance of accurate market information and client advocacy. An incorrect approach would be to downplay the market downturn and assure clients that prices will rebound quickly, encouraging them to proceed with transactions based on unrealistic expectations. This is ethically problematic as it misrepresents the market's current state and violates the duty to provide accurate information. It could lead to clients making poor financial decisions, potentially resulting in legal repercussions and disciplinary action from the Hawaii Real Estate Commission. Another incorrect approach is to advise clients to delay all transactions indefinitely, regardless of their individual circumstances or needs. While caution is warranted in a downturn, a blanket recommendation to halt all activity ignores the diverse motivations and financial situations of clients. This fails to provide tailored advice and may not serve the client's best interests, potentially violating the duty to act with reasonable diligence and professional competence. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to focus solely on securing a commission by pushing clients into transactions that are not in their best interest, even if the market is unfavorable. This prioritizes the salesperson's financial gain over the client's welfare, a clear breach of fiduciary duty and ethical standards. Such actions can lead to complaints, investigations, and severe penalties under Hawaii real estate law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client education and realistic expectations. This involves continuous market analysis, transparent communication, and a commitment to acting solely in the client's best interest, even when market conditions are challenging. Understanding the nuances of real estate cycles and their impact on property values is crucial for providing sound advice and maintaining professional integrity. Question 12. Market research demonstrates a growing demand for rental properties in Honolulu, Hawaii. A landlord client informs their real estate licensee that a tenant has repeatedly failed to pay rent on time, consistently submitting payments several days late over the past 6 months, and has also violated a lease clause by keeping an unauthorized pet. The landlord is frustrated and wants to initiate the eviction process immediately. What is the most legally sound and professionally responsible course of action for the licensee to advise the landlord? Option A. Advise the landlord to immediately file an eviction lawsuit with the court, as the tenant has demonstrated a pattern of noncompliance with the lease agreement. Option B. Advise the landlord to accept a verbal confirmation from the tenant that they will eventually pay the overdue rent and remove the pet, and then proceed with finding a new tenant. Option C. Advise the landlord to change the locks on the rental unit and remove the tenant's belongings to secure possession of the property. Option D. Advise the landlord to issue a written notice to cure or quit, clearly detailing the late rent payments and the unauthorized pet violation, and specifying the legal timeframe for the tenant to remedy these breaches or vacate the premises, in accordance with Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 521. The correct answer is D. Advise the landlord to issue a written notice to cure or quit, clearly detailing the late rent payments and the unauthorized pet violation, and specifying the legal timeframe for the tenant to remedy these breaches or vacate the premises, in accordance with Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 521. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves navigating the sensitive and legally complex eviction process in Hawaii, balancing the landlord's rights with the tenant's protections under Hawaii Revised Statutes, HRS. Chapter 521, the Residential Landlord-Tenant Code. A real estate licensee acting on behalf of a landlord must adhere strictly to these statutes to avoid legal repercussions for both themselves and their client. Misinterpreting or misapplying the eviction procedures can lead to significant legal liabilities, including wrongful eviction claims, fines, and damage to professional reputation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves advising the landlord to strictly follow the notice requirements outlined in HRS Chapter 521. This means ensuring the landlord issues a written notice to cure or quit that specifically states the grounds for eviction and provides the tenant with the legally mandated timeframe to remedy the breach or vacate the premises. For non-payment of rent, this typically requires a 5-day notice to cure or quit. For other lease violations, the notice period can vary but must be clearly defined and served according to statutory requirements. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal framework governing landlord-tenant relations in Hawaii, minimizing the risk of a flawed eviction process that could be challenged in court. Adhering to these specific statutory requirements is paramount for lawful eviction. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to advise the landlord to immediately file an eviction lawsuit without first providing the tenant with a proper written notice to cure or quit. This fails to comply with the mandatory notice provisions of HRS Chapter 521, rendering the eviction action invalid and potentially exposing the landlord and licensee to legal penalties for wrongful eviction. Another incorrect approach is to accept a verbal notice from the tenant regarding their intent to vacate, and then proceed with re-renting the property without any written documentation or confirmation. While a tenant may verbally communicate their intent, the landlord must still follow proper procedures for lease termination and possession, especially if there are outstanding issues or if the tenant does not fully vacate as stated. Relying solely on a verbal communication is insufficient and can lead to disputes. A third incorrect approach is to instruct the landlord to change the locks or physically remove the tenant's belongings from the property before a court order for possession is obtained. This constitutes a self-help eviction, which is strictly prohibited under HRS Chapter 521 and is considered illegal in Hawaii. Such actions can result in severe legal consequences for the landlord and the licensee involved. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Hawaii should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes strict adherence to the Hawaii Residential Landlord-Tenant Code, HRS Chapter 521. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the specific grounds for eviction and the corresponding notice requirements and timelines stipulated in the statute. 2. Documenting all communications and actions meticulously, ensuring all notices are in writing and properly served. 3. Consulting with legal counsel when any ambiguity arises or when dealing with complex eviction scenarios. 4. Always advising clients to act within the bounds of the law, emphasizing that illegal eviction tactics can have severe financial and legal repercussions. Question 13. The monitoring system demonstrates that a purchase agreement for a property in Honolulu, Hawaii, has been drafted by the seller's agent, but it only includes the street address and does not contain a legal description of the property. As a licensed real estate salesperson in Hawaii, what is the most appropriate action to ensure the enforceability of this contract? Option A. Advise the seller and buyer to include a precise legal description of the property in the purchase agreement before it is signed by both parties. Option B. Inform the parties that the contract is valid because the street address clearly identifies the property. Option C. Recommend that the parties sign the contract and address the legal description in a separate addendum after the initial agreement. Option D. Proceed with the contract as is, assuming the street address is sufficient for identification in Honolulu. The correct answer is A. Advise the seller and buyer to include a precise legal description of the property in the purchase agreement before it is signed by both parties. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a potential breach of contract enforceability due to a missing essential element. This scenario is professionally challenging because a real estate licensee must ensure that all contracts they facilitate meet the legal requirements for validity to protect their clients and maintain professional integrity. Failure to do so can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for all parties involved, including the licensee. The correct approach involves identifying the missing essential element and advising the parties to rectify it before the contract is considered fully executed and binding. This aligns with Hawaii Revised Statutes, HRS, Chapter 507, which outlines requirements for contracts related to real property. Specifically, a valid real estate contract in Hawaii, like elsewhere, requires offer, acceptance, consideration, legal purpose, and competent parties. In this case, the absence of a clear legal description of the property renders the contract potentially unenforceable. The licensee's duty is to ensure the contract is legally sound, which includes having all necessary components. By recommending the addition of a precise legal description, the licensee is upholding their fiduciary duty and adhering to the principles of contract law as applied in Hawaii. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the contract as is, assuming the parties understand the property being discussed. This is a failure to ensure the contract has a clear and definite subject matter, a fundamental requirement for enforceability under Hawaii contract law. Another incorrect approach is to advise the parties that the contract is valid despite the missing legal description, perhaps relying on a street address alone. While a street address might be sufficient for informal identification, it is not a legal description and can lead to disputes, making the contract vulnerable to legal challenge and potentially voidable. A further incorrect approach would be to ignore the issue and allow the transaction to proceed without addressing the deficiency. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the legal requirements for real estate contracts in Hawaii, potentially exposing the licensee to liability for facilitating an unenforceable agreement. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and client protection. This involves a thorough review of all contract documents for completeness and accuracy against established legal requirements. When a deficiency is identified, the professional's role is to inform the parties and guide them toward a legally sound resolution, rather than attempting to bypass or ignore the issue. This proactive approach safeguards all parties and upholds the integrity of the real estate transaction process in Hawaii. Question: the monitoring system demonstrates that a purchase agreement for a property in Honolulu, Hawaii, has been drafted by the seller's agent, but it only includes the street address and does not contain a legal description of the property. As a licensed real estate salesperson in Hawaii, what is the most appropriate action to ensure the enforceability of this contract? Options: A. Advise the seller and buyer to include a precise legal description of the property in the purchase agreement before it is signed by both parties. B. Proceed with the contract as is, assuming the street address is sufficient for identification in Honolulu. C. Inform the parties that the contract is valid because the street address clearly identifies the property. D. Recommend that the parties sign the contract and address the legal description in a separate addendum after the initial agreement. Question 14. Market research demonstrates a growing interest in short-term vacation rentals among potential buyers in Maui County, Hawaii. A licensee is representing a buyer who is specifically looking for a property that can be legally operated as a short-term vacation rental. What is the most responsible and legally compliant course of action for the licensee to ensure the buyer's objective can be met? Option A. Recommend that the buyer purchase the property and then independently investigate the possibility of obtaining the necessary permits or variances for short-term vacation rental use after closing. Option B. Thoroughly research the current zoning ordinances and land use regulations for Maui County pertaining to short-term vacation rentals in the specific areas the buyer is interested in, and advise the buyer based on these findings. Option C. Rely on the seller's disclosure statement, which indicates the property has been previously used for short-term rentals, and assume this use is still legally permissible. Option D. Advise the buyer that short-term vacation rentals are generally permitted in many tourist areas of Maui, and encourage them to proceed with offers on properties that appear suitable. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly research the current zoning ordinances and land use regulations for Maui County pertaining to short-term vacation rentals in the specific areas the buyer is interested in, and advise the buyer based on these findings. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate complex local zoning ordinances and land use regulations, which can vary significantly even within a single state like Hawaii. A licensee must balance their duty to their client with the legal requirements of the jurisdiction, ensuring that any proposed property use is compliant. Misinterpreting or ignoring these regulations can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for the client and disciplinary action for the licensee. The best approach involves proactively researching and understanding the specific zoning and land use regulations applicable to the subject property in Maui County. This includes identifying the property's current zoning designation, permitted uses, any existing variances or special permits, and potential future land use plans or restrictions. By thoroughly investigating these factors, the licensee can provide accurate and informed guidance to the buyer, ensuring their proposed use aligns with local ordinances. This proactive research is ethically and legally mandated, as licensees are expected to possess or acquire the necessary knowledge to advise clients on matters directly impacting a real estate transaction, including land use. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the seller's verbal assurances about the property's suitability for a specific use without independent verification. While sellers may believe their property is suitable, their understanding of zoning laws might be incomplete or outdated. This failure to verify can lead to a buyer making an offer based on false premises, resulting in a failed transaction and potential liability for the licensee. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because a particular use is common in the general area, it will be permitted for the specific property in question. Zoning regulations are highly specific, and a property's exact location, lot size, and surrounding uses can all influence permitted activities. General assumptions are not a substitute for diligent research into the specific zoning classification and its associated restrictions. Finally, advising the buyer to proceed with the purchase and then seek a variance or rezoning after closing is an irresponsible and potentially harmful approach. This places the burden and risk entirely on the buyer and could lead to significant delays, unexpected costs, or the inability to use the property as intended. A licensee's duty is to facilitate a compliant transaction, not to gamble on future regulatory approvals. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes due diligence and client education. This involves 1. Identifying the client's needs and intended use of the property. 2. Researching all applicable local zoning and land use regulations for the specific property. 3. Clearly communicating findings and potential limitations to the client. 4. Advising the client on the risks and benefits of proceeding based on the research. 5. Recommending consultation with local planning officials or legal counsel if complex issues arise. Question 15. Benchmark analysis indicates that a real estate salesperson in Hawaii, while listing a property, observes what appears to be an unusual discoloration in the soil near an old, disused shed on the property, and a faint chemical odor emanating from the area. The salesperson has no specific environmental training. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with environmental regulations and best professional practices? Option A. Withhold information about the observed discoloration and odor from the client and potential buyers, assuming it is a minor issue that will not impact the sale. Option B. Offer the client their opinion on the potential cause of the discoloration and odor, suggesting simple cleanup methods they can undertake before listing. Option C. Advise the client that the discoloration and odor are likely insignificant and not a cause for concern, proceeding with the listing without further investigation. Option D. Inform the client of the observations. Recommend they consult with a qualified environmental professional for an assessment, and ensure all relevant disclosures are made based on expert findings. Correct answer is D. Inform the client of the observations. Recommend they consult with a qualified environmental professional for an assessment, and ensure all relevant disclosures are made based on expert findings. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Hawaii to balance their fiduciary duty to their client with the legal and ethical obligations related to environmental disclosure and compliance. Navigating potential environmental concerns without overstepping professional boundaries or providing unqualified advice is crucial. Careful judgment is required to ensure transparency, protect the client's interests, and adhere to Hawaii's specific environmental regulations. The best professional approach involves proactively identifying potential environmental concerns and advising the client to seek expert consultation. This approach correctly prioritizes transparency and compliance by acknowledging the limitations of a salesperson's expertise. It involves informing the client about the potential environmental issues observed, recommending they engage qualified environmental professionals for assessment, and ensuring all relevant disclosures are made in accordance with Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 342D, Water Pollution, and Chapter 342J, Hazardous Waste Management, as well as any local ordinances. This upholds the salesperson's duty to act in the client's best interest by facilitating informed decision-making and mitigating future liability for both parties. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the observed concerns as minor or insignificant without any professional assessment. This fails to meet the ethical obligation of full disclosure and could lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for the client if the environmental issue is substantial. It also violates the principle of acting with reasonable care and diligence. Another incorrect approach would be for the salesperson to offer their own opinion or interpretation of the environmental conditions, attempting to diagnose the problem or suggest remediation strategies. This constitutes practicing outside the scope of a real estate license and could lead to providing inaccurate information, which is a violation of professional conduct and potentially Hawaii's real estate licensing laws. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to withhold information about the observed environmental concerns from the client or potential buyers, hoping the issue will not be discovered. This is a clear breach of fiduciary duty and ethical standards, as well as a violation of disclosure requirements under Hawaii law, potentially leading to rescission of the sale and severe penalties. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that emphasizes due diligence, transparency, and professional boundaries. When environmental concerns arise, the process should involve 1. Observation and documentation. Note any visible or apparent environmental issues. 2. Disclosure. Inform the client of the observations. 3. Recommendation for expert consultation. Advise the client to engage qualified environmental professionals for assessment and advice. 4. Facilitation. Assist the client in obtaining necessary information and disclosures from experts. 5. Adherence to regulations. Ensure all disclosures and actions comply with Hawaii's environmental and real estate laws. Question 16. Compliance review shows a real estate salesperson in Hawaii is assisting a buyer who is unfamiliar with mortgage financing options. The salesperson has a general understanding of different loan types available in the state. What is the most appropriate course of action for the salesperson to ensure the buyer makes an informed decision while adhering to Hawaii's real estate and lending regulations? Option A. Explain the general characteristics of various loan types available in Hawaii and strongly advise the buyer to consult with a licensed mortgage broker or lender to discuss their specific financial situation and eligibility. Option B. Assure the buyer that based on their initial financial information, a particular type of loan is almost certainly going to be approved. Option C. Detail only the lowest available interest rates for different loan products without discussing other loan terms or the need for professional consultation. Option D. Recommend a specific mortgage lender that the salesperson has had positive experiences with in the past, suggesting they are likely to offer the best terms. Correct answer is A. Explain the general characteristics of various loan types available in Hawaii and strongly advise the buyer to consult with a licensed mortgage broker or lender to discuss their specific financial situation and eligibility. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate salesperson in Hawaii to navigate the complexities of financing options while adhering strictly to disclosure requirements and avoiding misrepresentation. The salesperson must balance assisting the client with understanding their options against the legal and ethical obligation to provide accurate, unbiased information without offering advice beyond their licensing scope. Missteps can lead to significant legal repercussions, damage to reputation, and harm to the client's financial well-being. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the salesperson acting as a facilitator of information and a connector to qualified professionals. This approach entails clearly explaining the different types of financing available in Hawaii, such as conventional loans, FHA loans, VA loans, and USDA loans, and outlining their general characteristics. Crucially, the salesperson must then advise the buyer to consult with a licensed mortgage broker or lender to discuss their specific financial situation, creditworthiness, and eligibility for each loan type. This ensures the buyer receives personalized, expert advice tailored to their circumstances, which is beyond the scope of a real estate salesperson's license. This approach aligns with Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 467, which governs real estate licensing and prohibits unlicensed practice of mortgage brokering or lending. It upholds the ethical duty of honesty and fair dealing by not overstepping professional boundaries and by directing the client to the appropriate licensed professionals for specialized advice. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending a specific lender or loan product based on personal opinion or perceived benefit to the salesperson is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This constitutes providing financial advice or acting as an unlicensed mortgage broker, which is a violation of Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 467. It creates a conflict of interest and can lead to the client choosing a loan that is not in their best financial interest. Suggesting that a particular financing option is guaranteed to be approved for the buyer, even if the salesperson has a positive impression of the buyer's financial standing, is also a regulatory and ethical violation. Real estate salespeople are not qualified to assess creditworthiness or guarantee loan approvals. Such a statement constitutes misrepresentation and could lead to severe consequences for the buyer if the loan is denied. Focusing solely on the lowest interest rate without discussing other crucial loan terms like closing costs, points, or loan duration is an incomplete and potentially misleading approach. While interest rate is important, A comprehensive understanding of all loan terms is necessary for the buyer to make an informed decision. This failure to provide a holistic overview can lead to the buyer being unaware of hidden costs or unfavorable terms, violating the duty of full disclosure and fair dealing. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes client well-being and strict adherence to legal and ethical boundaries. This involves understanding the scope of their license, identifying situations where specialized expertise is required, and confidently referring clients to appropriate licensed professionals. Transparency about what services can and cannot be provided is paramount. When faced with financing discussions, the salesperson's role is to educate on general options and facilitate connections with qualified lenders, not to provide specific financial advice or make recommendations that could be construed as unlicensed activity. Question 17. Compliance review shows that a real estate licensee in Hawaii is assisting a landlord in screening multiple rental applications. Which of the following tenant screening and selection processes best aligns with Hawaii's regulatory framework and ethical best practices? Option A. Rejecting an applicant immediately because they mention having a large family, without reviewing their financial qualifications or rental history. Option B. Asking potential tenants about their religious affiliations to gauge their perceived stability and responsibility. Option C. Favoring an applicant who appears particularly friendly and personable during the initial viewing, even if their credit report shows a slightly lower score than other applicants. Option D. Utilizing a standardized rental application that uniformly collects verifiable information on income, credit history, and rental history from all applicants, and then objectively evaluating this information against predefined, non-discriminatory criteria. The correct answer is D. Utilizing a standardized rental application that uniformly collects verifiable information on income, credit history, and rental history from all applicants, and then objectively evaluating this information against predefined, non-discriminatory criteria. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate licensee in Hawaii to balance the landlord's desire to select the most financially stable tenant with the legal and ethical obligations to avoid discriminatory practices. The licensee must navigate the Hawaii Residential Landlord-Tenant Code and fair housing laws to ensure the screening process is both effective and compliant. The best professional approach involves establishing clear, objective, and non-discriminatory criteria for tenant selection that are applied consistently to all applicants. This includes verifying income, credit history, and rental history through standardized methods, such as a uniform application form and third-party screening services. This approach is correct because it adheres to Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 324, which prohibits discrimination in housing based on protected characteristics, and aligns with best practices for fair housing. By focusing on financial qualifications and past tenancy performance in a consistent manner, the licensee minimizes the risk of implicit bias influencing the decision and ensures all applicants are evaluated on their ability to meet the lease obligations. An incorrect approach involves prioritizing an applicant based on subjective factors or personal impressions, such as their perceived friendliness or the licensee's personal opinion of their character, without a standardized, objective evaluation of their financial and rental history. This is ethically problematic and legally risky, as it opens the door to unconscious bias and potential discrimination, violating fair housing principles. Another incorrect approach is to reject an applicant solely based on a minor past issue, such as a single late rent payment several years ago, without considering the applicant's overall financial stability, creditworthiness, and the context of the past issue. This can be considered overly punitive and may not reflect the applicant's current ability to be a reliable tenant, potentially leading to an unfair rejection. A third incorrect approach is to request information from applicants that is not directly related to their ability to pay rent or maintain the property, such as their marital status, number of children, or plans for future family growth. This type of inquiry is often considered discriminatory and is prohibited under fair housing laws, as it can be used as a pretext for unlawful discrimination. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding and internalizing fair housing laws and the Hawaii Residential Landlord-Tenant Code. This framework requires developing a standardized screening process with objective criteria that are applied equally to all applicants. When evaluating applicants, licensees should focus on verifiable information such as credit reports, income verification, and references from previous landlords, while consciously avoiding any subjective judgments or inquiries into protected characteristics. Regular training on fair housing and ethical conduct is crucial to maintain awareness and prevent discriminatory practices. Question 18. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a real estate salesperson in Hawaii is listing a condominium unit. During the initial property review, the salesperson notices that the property is advertised as having ocean views and is located in a desirable area. However, the salesperson has not yet confirmed the exact nature of the ownership interest associated with the unit. What is the most prudent and legally compliant approach for the salesperson to take regarding property rights and ownership disclosure? Option A. Proceed with marketing the property based on its desirable location and features, assuming it is fee-simple ownership unless the seller explicitly states otherwise, and address ownership details only if a buyer specifically inquires. Option B. Focus marketing efforts on the property's amenities and views, and provide a generic disclosure statement about property ownership that does not specifically differentiate between fee-simple and leasehold interests, leaving the buyer to interpret the implications. Option C. Immediately investigate and confirm whether the ownership is fee-simple or leasehold, and if leasehold, obtain and thoroughly review the lease agreement to understand its terms, duration, and any associated obligations before marketing the property and disclosing this information clearly and comprehensively to all potential buyers. Option D. Market the property as fee-simple ownership, as this is the most common and desirable form of ownership, and address any potential leasehold complexities only if they become a significant obstacle during negotiations. The correct answer is C. Immediately investigate and confirm whether the ownership is fee-simple or leasehold, and if leasehold, obtain and thoroughly review the lease agreement to understand its terms, duration, and any associated obligations, before marketing the property and disclosing this information clearly and comprehensively to all potential buyers. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Hawaii to navigate the complexities of property rights, specifically distinguishing between fee-simple ownership and leasehold interests, and to accurately represent these distinctions to potential buyers. Misrepresenting or failing to clearly explain these fundamental ownership structures can lead to significant legal disputes, financial losses for buyers, and disciplinary action against the licensee by the Hawaii Real Estate Commission. Careful judgment is required to ensure full disclosure and understanding of the property's title. The best professional practice involves thoroughly investigating and clearly disclosing the exact nature of the property ownership. This includes identifying whether the property is held in fee simple, where the owner possesses the land and all improvements indefinitely, or if it is a leasehold interest, where the buyer obtains the right to use the land for a specified period under a lease agreement with the landowner. The salesperson must then provide all relevant documentation, such as the lease agreement, and explain its terms, including the remaining lease term, rent escalation clauses, and any renewal options or obligations. This approach aligns with Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 467, which mandates licensees to act with honesty, integrity, and competence, and to disclose all material facts affecting the value or desirability of a property. Ethical obligations under the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics, if applicable, also emphasize full disclosure and avoiding misrepresentation. Failing to identify and disclose the leasehold nature of the property is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This misrepresentation or omission directly violates the duty to disclose material facts and can lead to a breach of contract and potential lawsuits. It also undermines the buyer's ability to make an informed decision, which is a cornerstone of fair housing and ethical real estate practice. Another incorrect approach involves assuming that all properties are fee simple unless explicitly stated otherwise. This assumption is dangerous and unprofessional in Hawaii, where leasehold properties are common, particularly in certain areas. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to the statutory requirement of disclosing all material facts. Presenting the leasehold interest as equivalent to fee-simple ownership is also a critical error. This mischaracterization is a direct misrepresentation of a material fact, which can have severe financial and legal consequences for the buyer. It violates the licensee's duty to be truthful and accurate in all dealings. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a proactive and diligent approach to understanding property rights. This includes 1. Always verifying the type of ownership interest being offered. 2. Obtaining and reviewing all relevant title documents and lease agreements. 3. Clearly and comprehensively explaining the terms and implications of the ownership structure to the buyer, using plain language and providing opportunities for questions. 4. Recommending that buyers seek independent legal counsel to review all documents and understand their rights and obligations. 5. Documenting all disclosures made to the buyer. Question 19. Quality control measures reveal that a real estate licensee in Hawaii is working with a prospective buyer who expresses a strong preference for a neighborhood with a predominantly similar ethnic background to their own, stating, "I'd feel more comfortable if we focused our search on areas where most people are like us." What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the licensee? Option A. Agree to the buyer's request and focus the search exclusively on neighborhoods that match the buyer's stated ethnic preference, assuring them that this is a common request. Option B. Proceed with the search based on other criteria the buyer has mentioned, such as price range and number of bedrooms, without directly addressing the buyer's comment about ethnic composition. Option C. Politely explain to the buyer that steering clients to or away from neighborhoods based on race or ethnicity is illegal under Hawaii's fair housing laws, and offer to focus the search on objective criteria such as proximity to amenities, school districts, or specific property features that meet their stated needs. Option D. Inform the buyer that while you understand their preference, you cannot accommodate it due to personal beliefs, and suggest they find another agent who might be more aligned with their search criteria. The correct answer is C. Politely explain to the buyer that steering clients to or away from neighborhoods based on race or ethnicity is illegal under Hawaii's fair housing laws, and offer to focus the search on objective criteria such as proximity to amenities, school districts, or specific property features that meet their stated needs. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate a delicate situation where a potential client's stated preference could inadvertently lead to discriminatory practices, violating fair housing laws. The licensee must balance the client's expressed desires with their legal and ethical obligations under Hawaii's fair housing regulations. Careful judgment is required to educate the client and steer them towards lawful and ethical decision-making without alienating them or appearing to disregard their concerns. The best professional approach involves actively educating the client about Hawaii's fair housing laws, specifically the prohibition of discrimination based on protected characteristics. This means clearly explaining that steering a client towards or away from neighborhoods based on the racial or ethnic composition of those neighborhoods is illegal. The licensee should then pivot the conversation to focus on objective criteria that align with the client's stated needs, such as proximity to amenities, school districts, or specific property features, while emphasizing that neighborhood demographics cannot be a factor in the search. This approach upholds the licensee's legal duty to comply with fair housing laws and their ethical commitment to providing equal service to all clients. An incorrect approach involves agreeing to the client's request to focus on neighborhoods with a specific racial or ethnic makeup. This directly violates Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 325, which prohibits discrimination in housing. Such an action constitutes steering, a form of illegal discrimination, and can lead to severe penalties, including license revocation and civil lawsuits. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the client's comment and proceed with a search based solely on other criteria without addressing the discriminatory undertone. While not as overtly discriminatory as agreeing to the request, this approach fails to educate the client and prevent potential future violations. It also misses an opportunity to reinforce fair housing principles and maintain professional integrity. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's comment outright without explanation or offering alternative, lawful search criteria. While the intention might be to avoid engaging in discriminatory practices, this can be perceived as unprofessional and unhelpful, potentially leading to a negative client experience and failing to fulfill the licensee's duty to guide the client appropriately within legal boundaries. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying potential fair housing issues in client requests. 2. understanding the specific protections afforded by Hawaii's fair housing laws. 3. Proactively educating clients about these laws and their implications. 4. Redirecting client requests towards objective, non-discriminatory criteria. 5. Documenting all client interactions and decisions to ensure accountability and provide a record of compliance. Question 20. The risk matrix shows that a real estate licensee in Hawaii is representing a seller and has also been approached by a prospective buyer interested in the seller's property. The licensee believes they can effectively represent both parties, but wants to ensure they are compliant with Hawaii's real estate regulations. If the licensee decides to proceed with representing both the seller and the buyer in this transaction, what is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action regarding the agency relationship? Option A. Proceed with representing both parties, assuming that verbal communication of the dual agency situation is sufficient, as long as the licensee believes they can be fair to both. Option B. Prioritize the interests of the seller, as they were the initial client, and disclose to the buyer that the licensee's primary loyalty lies with the seller. Option C. Obtain written informed consent from both the seller and the buyer, clearly outlining the nature of dual agency and the limitations on the licensee's advocacy for each party before proceeding with the transaction. Option D. Decline to represent the buyer and suggest they find another agent, but continue to represent the seller, as this avoids the complexities of dual agency. The correct answer is C. Obtain written informed consent from both the seller and the buyer, clearly outlining the nature of dual agency and the limitations on the licensee's advocacy for each party before proceeding with the transaction. Explanation. The risk matrix shows that navigating agency relationships in Hawaii real estate transactions presents significant challenges due to the potential for conflicts of interest and the need for clear, informed consent. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a licensee to balance their fiduciary duties to their client with the legal and ethical obligations of disclosure and fairness when dealing with other parties, especially in a dual agency situation. Careful judgment is required to ensure all parties understand the implications of the agency relationship and that no party is disadvantaged. The best professional practice involves a proactive and transparent approach to disclosing potential conflicts and obtaining informed consent. This means clearly explaining the nature of dual agency to both the seller and the buyer, outlining the limitations on the agent's ability to advocate for each party's individual best interests, and securing written consent from both parties before proceeding. This approach aligns with Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 467, which mandates fair dealing and disclosure, and the ethical principles of the National Association of Realtors Registered, emphasizing honesty and integrity. By prioritizing informed consent and clear communication, the licensee upholds their fiduciary duties and avoids potential legal and ethical breaches. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with representing both parties without fully disclosing the implications of dual agency or obtaining explicit written consent. This failure to disclose violates Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 467, which requires licensees to act with honesty and disclose all material facts. It also breaches the ethical obligation to avoid misrepresentation and to act in the best interests of the client, as dual agency inherently creates a conflict where the agent cannot fully advocate for one party over the other. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize the interests of one party over the other within a dual agency relationship. This is a direct violation of the agent's fiduciary duty to both parties, which requires impartiality and fair representation. Such an action would not only be unethical, but could also lead to legal repercussions under Hawaii law for breach of fiduciary duty and potentially misrepresentation. Finally, assuming that verbal consent for dual agency is sufficient is also an incorrect and risky approach. While verbal communication is important, Hawaii real estate law and professional standards generally require written consent for dual agency to provide clear documentation and evidence of informed agreement from both parties. Relying solely on verbal consent leaves room for misunderstandings and disputes, and fails to meet the standard of clear, documented disclosure and consent. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest early in the transaction. This involves a thorough understanding of agency law in Hawaii and the specific duties owed to clients. When a dual agency situation arises, The professional must immediately assess the feasibility of representing both parties ethically and legally. This assessment should include a clear explanation of the limitations and potential conflicts to both parties, followed by the procurement of informed, written consent. If at any point the licensee believes they cannot adequately represent both parties without compromising their fiduciary duties or violating regulations, they should decline to enter into dual agency and advise the parties to seek separate representation.